Well, Trump's latest tweets are only adding to GOP concerns about his overall image. Tomorrow, he heads to Ohio to deliver a speech on ISIS. In the meantime, Congress could receive FBI notes from the agency's interview with Clinton over her private email server, possibly by tomorrow, according to broadcast reports. There are a lot of developments relating to campaign 2016, including the ongoing tax return issue. So much to talk about, and the week hasn't even started. Professor Jack Pitney from the Political Science Department at Claremont McKenna College joins us again now. Gosh, don't know where to start here, but all right, we'll touch on the economy in just a minute. But people are starting to, at least the polls are starting to show, to be driven away a little bit from Trump and now going over to Hillary Clinton. We're seeing in some of the battleground states she's gaining, obviously, and Trump seems to be setting up an excuse for why he may lose this election. Are you seeing the same thing?
Yes, he's going after the media, which is a great way to get applause at Republican rallies, not a great way to appeal to moderate and independent voters. And that's what Trump's doing. He's doing whatever gets applause, which gratifies his ego, but is not a good campaign strategy. This is not a campaign that's following the usual laws of politics.
You know, before last week, when both candidates gave their economic speeches about what they would do about our economy, in a lot of polls, Trump seemed to be ahead of Clinton on many different levels. After their speeches last week, it seems to me that Clinton, based on a couple of polls, is now starting to pull ahead of Trump. What changed?
Well, a couple of things. Trump's economic message was designed to appeal to upper income voters. He talks about tax cuts. 45% of U.S. households, though, pay no federal income tax. And so his plans didn't affect a lot of the people he needs to appeal to. Clinton's plan, much more targeted toward people of modest means. Also, Trump stepped over his own message with his comments on the Second Amendment. Any good he got out of the economic speech, gone. People start wondering, is this guy actually hinting about violence? Not a position you want to be in when you're running for president.
Yeah, I don't want to make any ambiguous statements like that there, but it certainly seems to be hurting him. Not only that, his comments about ISIS, there's some back and forth about him being serious and then not serious. Of course, you know that he said that he was joking when he said President Barack Obama founded ISIS and that Clinton was the co-founder. He's backtracked and said it was sarcasm. But his own running mate said, apparently on Fox News today, that he actually stands behind those statements and that he believes that. So what page are these two candidates on here, Trump and his own running mate?
There's no book, there's no page. This is the gang that couldn't shoot straight. At every step of the way, the Trump campaign shows a startling lack of professionalism. In fact, this week, another one of his spokespeople went on TV and claimed that President Obama started the war in Afghanistan, which started in 2001 when George W. Bush was president. And this is a spokesperson for a major presidential campaign. So even at the basic level of message discipline, there's a startling lack of competence.
What about the fact that Trump still maintains he's not going to release his tax returns, yet Pence says he will? Again, that's kind of a lack of solidarity there between the presidential nominee, Republican presidential nominee, and his running mate.
You have to wonder what those conversations are. If Trump isn't going to release his returns, you would expect that Pence would be consistent with that. And this happens after Hillary Clinton released her returns, which normally would be a subject of some criticism. She's very wealthy. She's had financial issues in the past. But Trump's refusal to release his returns gives her the opportunity to say, what's he hiding?
You know, Clinton obviously isn't without her own controversy as well. We're talking about the FBI notes regarding her interview about her email server and some of the classified emails that she apparently sent through her own server. How is this going to affect her the rest of the campaign? It doesn't seem to be affecting her now, although it is a rather large controversy as well.
Normally in a campaign, this would be very, very damaging to her because there are real issues involved here. But over and over again, things happen on the Trump side that eclipse it. Right now, a breaking story is that campaign manager Paul Manafort had his name on a ledger of the Ukrainian ruling party, millions of dollars in cash payments. That's going to be the big story at a time when Trump wants to draw the message to his negative attack on Clinton and his own message on foreign policy.
All right, Professor Jack Pitney, thank you again so much for joining us and giving us your insight into politics. I'm sure we're going to be seeing a lot of you in the coming months leading up to the election. Thank you.